The African Deep Dive podcast is brought to you by the African Technology Policy Studies Network. This podcast explores how science, technology, and innovation can drive sustainable development and global inclusion in Africa.
All right, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into a question we got from one of our listeners about clean cookstove policies in Kenya and Tanzania. You know, you guys ask for it, we try to deliver.
Yeah.
And we've got a pretty in-depth report here from the African Technology Policy Studies Network, the ATPS.
Yeah, and this is really important because when you look at East Africa, over 81% of the population, still depends on wood and charcoal for cooking.
Which is a huge number.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that brings with it some pretty serious implications.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking about, indoor air pollution.
Yeah.
And it's, we're talking thousands of lives lost every year. The report suggests around 15,000 in Kenya and close to 19,000 in Tanzania.
Yeah. And it's not just, the human costs, it's also the environmental impact. I mean, we're talking deforestation, greenhouse gas emissions, land degradation. It's just this, this whole cycle.
That's a cycle we need to break. So when we think about access to modern energy, I mean, it's so important for, for development. So that figure, over 81%, just underscores how urgent and how big of a problem it is to find better solutions for cooking.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this isn't exactly a new issue. The report points out that this journey with clean cook stoves in East Africa actually started back in the 1980s with the Kenyan Ceramic Jiko, the KCJ.
Yeah, and actually the KCJ was inspired by a 1981 UN conference right there in Nairobi.
Interesting.
It was basically an adaptation of something called a Thai bucket stove.
Oh, yeah.
One of the early attempts to bring in more efficient cooking methods.
Yeah, yeah. And it wasn't just that. There were other early designs, too, like the Mandaleo and the Jiko Kisa.
Right.
Which were really aimed at being these affordable, stationary, wood-burning stoves made from local materials.
Yeah.
Pretty cool.
Yeah. And then the German development agency, GIZ, they also played a role introducing what's known as the rocket stove. And these were, they were more efficient and came in portable and fixed versions, but a little bit more expensive.
Okay.
But what's really interesting is that this is when local artisans started getting training. And that spurred some of their own innovations.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So that local ingenuity led to stoves like the Kuni and Mbili, which, could do multiple things, and the Uhai stove.
Yeah.
And then around, I think it was 2010, the Kenyan market saw more variety with, imported stoves like EnviroFit appearing alongside locally made ones.
Right.
Like the Jiko Poa,
right.
the PC, Uhai. And, different rocket designs.
And what's cool about the Jiko Po is that a company called Fine Engineering started using mechanized production.
Oh, wow.
So that's really a key step towards, larger scale. And that brings us to the fact that Kenya has a more developed commercial market for clean cook stoves with small to medium scale production.
Yeah, and the numbers show that. GVEP International estimates that somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million Kenyan households are using some kind of improved cook stove. And these usually cost between $6 and $20.
Wow.
And the national adoption rate's estimated to be around 47%.
What I find really interesting about those numbers is the concentration in urban areas.
Yeah.
So Nairobi, for example, has around 500,000 households using the KCJ, and roughly the same number being sold every year.
Yeah.
Just in Nairobi.
Just in Nairobi. Wow.
Oh.
So there's definitely a bigger, demand there.
Absolutely.
But here's a key thing that I think is really important. A lot of these clean cook stoves in Kenya, they still don't meet the Tier 2 efficiency standards, defined by the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves.
Yeah.
So while there are more people using better stoves, there's still a big opportunity to really improve the quality of those technologies and to make them even better.
Absolutely. And even the way fuel is used tells a story. So the report suggests that about 50 to 60% of charcoal users, they're using clean cook stoves.
Okay.
And that goes up to 80% in Nairobi and Mombasa.
Oh, wow.
But the adoption of improved wood stoves, that's a lot lower. It's around 4%, although it's higher in places where there are specific programs, working on that.
Yeah. It seems like, in lower income urban households, a lot of them are still using kerosene stoves because They're cheap to buy up front.
Yeah.
And then there's, Envirofit. They're actually building a production facility in Kenya.
Right.
So, they're really looking at the long game.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now let's talk about LPG, liquefied petroleum gas. The report says that it's kind of underdeveloped in Kenya, with only 5 to 7% of households using it for cooking.
Yeah.
And that the split between urban and rural is just, it's big. 21% urban, 1% rural. And Nairobi, get this, accounts for 60% of all the LPG used.
Wow.
Wow.
That's a lot.
It is. So the fact that it's not being used as much is probably because, LPG can be expensive.
Yeah.
For a lot of people. But there are some cool initiatives trying to change that.
Yeah,
right?
definitely.
Like Pima Gas.
Yeah.
Which offers these smaller cylinders, with lower refill costs.
Right.
So that seems like it could be helpful.
Yeah, for sure. It's really about, making it easier for people to get started and making these cleaner fuels more affordable.
Yeah.
So, that gives us a picture of, how clean cook stoves have kind of come about in Kenya, where things stand.
Yeah. So what about like the actual efforts to, to get people to use them?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the report really emphasizes that it's really a team effort.
Right.
We see NGOs, civil society groups, private companies, international donors all working together with Kenyan national institutions.
Okay.
And, the Ministry of Energy has played a really big part historically. And they're currently pushing initiatives like the Energy Plus initiative, Kerosene-Free Kenya, Sustainable Energy for All.
Yeah. And, the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, they've also been pretty active. They have projects like the Low Emission Capacity Building Program, the Standards and Labeling Program, and other things really focused on just getting more access to clean energy services out there.
Yeah, and that's really crucial. These programs, they help build, the capacity on the ground and set up the frameworks.
For sure. And then you've got the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves, the GACC.
Yeah.
They're working really closely with the Clean Cook Stoves Association of Kenya, that's the CCAK,
Right.
and government ministries and the World Bank.
Right.
Their original aim was to get 1 million improved cook stoves being used in Kenya by 2020. And the report says that the actual number now is somewhere between 1.5 and 3.5 million.
Wow.
But most of them are still at that basic Tier 1 efficiency level. So progress, but still work to do.
Yeah, definitely. Getting the more efficient stoves into people's homes. That's the next hurdle.
Yeah. And we can't forget about GVEP International's Developing Energy Enterprises Project, DEEP.
Yeah.
It looks like they've done some really good work helping energy entrepreneurs and reaching over 4 million beneficiaries. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, and there are programs like the Africa Biogas Partnership Program, the ABPP, that SNV and HIVOs are doing, promoting biogas digesters. So there's a lot happening on that front.
Yeah. And GACC's latest efforts, managed by CCAC and supported by ISAC, those are still focused on getting clean cook stoves to at least 1 million households. So that's still the goal.
Wow.
So the report actually gives us a good look at some specific projects.
Yeah.
And the challenges they face. So like SCODE, working with IPOS, they had problems with consistent quality when getting parts.
Right.
DEEP actually had to kind of help entrepreneurs adopt a more market-oriented way of thinking about their work.
Yeah.
And then the Uganda Carbon Bureau, they actually had delays in the whole process of, getting carbon credits for their emissions reductions.
Wow.
S&V had to really focus on educating consumers.
Right.
GIZ was focused on maintaining those quality standards.
Yeah.
Paradigm Project, they really focused on getting those distribution networks set up. And CO2 Balance, they were dealing with how to, get continuous funding. So there are lots of different challenges.
Yeah, definitely. So it's not just, having the stove, it's the whole system.
Exactly.
From the beginning to the end.
Totally. So what's the policy environment like in Kenya? What's really helping or hurting all of this?
Well, Kenya has actually made some pretty big steps toward creating, a positive policy environment.
Okay.
And I think one of the most impactful things was actually getting rid of the 16% VAT on LPG.
Oh, wow.
Back in 2016.
Yeah.
that had a big impact on how many people were adopting it.
Yeah, for sure. And they also, raised the price of kerosene,
Oh, yeah.
to try and discourage people from using it.
Right.
And then also, they reduced the import duty on energy-efficient cook stoves from 25% to 10%.
That's huge.
Which is, that's a big deal, right?
It is.
Because that kind of brings them more in line with, other clean energy technology.
Yeah, and this really shows that the government is willing to change and adapt their policies and align them with, international goals.
Right.
Like sustainable energy for all, SE for all, the SDGs, and even Kenya's own climate action commitments.
Yeah. So let's dive into those specific Kenyan policies.
Okay.
That are, helping support clean cook stoves. So where do we start?
Well, the 2010 Constitution is really the foundation. It emphasizes devolution, equity, and environmental rights,
Okay.
including a goal of reaching 10% forest cover. So when you think about it, the demand for wood is actually exceeding the supply by over 10 million cubic meters.
Oh,
So, clean cook stoves that use less wood, they're directly helping with that.
exactly.
And the Constitution also guarantees everyone the right to a clean and healthy environment.
Absolutely. And then there's Vision 2030. That's Kenya's long-term, development plan.
Yeah.
And it actually, it sees promoting clean cook stoves as a way to not only help that forest cover, but also to create new economic opportunities.
Right.
So there's, there are all these side benefits: reduced emissions, improved health.
Yeah.
And that fits with their, their overall vision for the country.
And then you have the third medium-term plan, the MTP3.
Yeah.
That's for 2018 to 2022.
Okay.
And that continues this focus: environmental protection, climate resilience, and making sure there's more renewable energy being used. It even talks about potential public-private partnerships in the clean cooking sector.
And then the National Energy and Petroleum Policy from 2015, that one really lays out the challenges, the difference between how many wood do we have and how much we need, the emissions problem, the health problems from indoor air pollution. And it says we really need to move away from kerosene and wood fuel.
Yeah.
Especially when you think about the fact that firewood and charcoal make up like 69% of all the energy they use.
Yeah, that's a huge amount.
Yeah. Then you've got the National Energy Policy from 2014 that also reinforces this idea of, affordable and sustainable energy and supporting local technologies.
Right.
And then you've got the Energy Bill of 2015, which, it does set up all these regulatory bodies, but also includes things about promoting renewable energy, things like biomass, charcoal, fuel wood, biogas. It also talks a lot about prioritizing Kenyan citizens and locally produced goods and services. But the report does say that it's not always clear how decisions are made within those local offices. And then there's the National Climate Change Action Plan from 2013. This one's really interesting because it actually picks out improved cook stoves as a top way to cut down emissions. And they're thinking about all the benefits, less wood being used, less deforestation, better air quality inside homes, and time saved, especially for women.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then there's also the Green Economy Strategy and Implementation Plan. That's from 2016 to 2030.
Right. Yeah.
And it may not focus on cook stoves directly, but it does talk about, eco-innovation and getting rid of indoor air pollution, which are really central to clean cooking, right?
Yeah, for sure. And then finally, the Forest Conservation and Management Act of 2016, that actually reversed a ban they had on charcoal burning.
Oh, wow.
But now they're trying to, to manage it in a sustainable way. But, the immediate result has been higher charcoal prices.
Yeah. So it seems like Kenya has a lot of policies that should really help the clean cook stove sector.
Yeah.
But, the report also talks about some areas where things are missing. What are those key gaps?
Well, taxes and tariffs are still a big one.
Okay.
Even though they've been reduced, that 10% import duty on efficient cook stoves, it can still make them less competitive.
Yeah. And what about ensuring that the cook stoves being used are actually good and safe?
Right. That's another big gap.
Okay.
You have these international ISO standards, but the local ones aren't always in line with those.
Yeah.
A lot of stoves that are made locally, they aren't tested. And the cost of testing can be a big problem for smaller manufacturers.
Right.
And there's not really a clear, widely understood labeling system, to help people figure out how different stoves perform.
Right.
Although they did set up a Cookstove Standards and Labeling Committee back in 2017, so that's good.
Yeah. That's a good step.
And then there's also the problem of conflicting claims from different testing labs
Right.
in other countries. So, it can be hard for consumers to know what to trust.
Yeah. So what about the fuels themselves? Are there any policy gaps when it comes to, wood, charcoal, all those different things that people are using?
Yeah, there are. Policies often focus more on what we call modern fuels,
Okay.
and that can sometimes mean overlooking sustainable management of, biomass resources,
Yeah.
even though that's what most people are using. And there isn't enough investment in forestry management.
Okay.
And then there are these debates about charcoal production. For example, Kitui County has a ban on it.
Oh, wow.
So there's not a really clear, consistent approach to biomass fuels.
Yeah, to a lack of consistency there. And then there's also the challenge of getting financing.
Yes, that is a major problem for both manufacturers and distributors. It limits their ability to invest in new ideas, to make more stoves, to improve their distribution networks, and to market their products effectively.
Totally. So it's, a whole chain reaction there.
Yeah, it affects the whole value chain.
Yeah. So with all these different organizations and policies involved, who are the main players in Kenya's, clean cookstove world?
It's a pretty diverse group.
Okay.
On the government side, you've got the Ministry of Energy and Petroleum, NEMA.
That's the National Environment Management Authority.
Right, KBS.
The Kenya Bureau of Standards.
Right. You've got KIRDI.
That's the Kenya Industrial Research and Development Institute.
Right. And the Energy Regulatory Commission.
Right.
And the Council of Governors.
Yeah.
Among others. And then you've got international donors and development partners like the World Bank, GIZ, USAA.
Yeah.
There are a lot of NGOs, like HIVOS and GACC. And then there's the private sector with companies like Kenya Ceramics, EnviroFit, and then industry associations like CCAC.
Right.
And of course, specific cookstove programs like DEEP and ESMAP.
Yeah.
The report has a nice little visual that shows how much influence all these different groups have and how interested they are in this.
Okay. Cool. So that gives us a good picture of Kenya. Now let's switch gears and talk about Tanzania. How did the clean cookstove thing get going over there?
So similar to Kenya, it actually started, about 40 years ago.
Okay.
With the Morogoro wood and charcoal stove.
Okay.
And this was actually a project between local universities and international donors. And it was pretty successful.
Okay.
And then the Tanzanian government, with help from the World Bank, they brought the Kenyan Ceramic Jiko, the KCJ,
Right.
into Tanzania in 1988.
So Kenya's early experience actually had a direct impact.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a direct transfer of knowledge and technology.
That's cool. So what happened after they brought the KCJ in?
So Tanzania actually developed some of its own local designs, like the KUT and the Jiko Bora.
Okay.
And organizations like COSTECH, that's the Tanzania Commission for Science and Technology,
Yep.
and TATITO, the Tanzania Traditional Energy Development and Organization.
Right.
They became really important for research and promotion of these stoves.
Yeah.
But one key difference compared to Kenya is that Tanzania has had a lot of these smaller scale projects, often funded by donors, but with short-term funding.
Right.
So that's led to a situation where you have a lot of informal artisans who don't really have the ability to produce on a large scale.
Yeah.
And that affects quality.
Yeah. So less of a, kind of a consistent market compared to Kenya, especially out in the rural areas where these stoves could really help people.
Exactly. And even though you have these imported clean cook stoves, with better efficiency and less indoor air pollution,
Right.
their adoption has been limited because of the higher prices and, just lower demand.
Yeah.
So UNIDO estimates from 2015 put the adoption rate in Dar es Salaam at around 40%.
Okay.
In other urban areas, around 20%, but only 3% nationally.
Wow.
Yeah.
That national number is, it's pretty low.
It is.
And the report mentions that the word clean is kind of relative. What does that mean in the Tanzanian context?
So basically what's considered clean depends on what you're trying to improve, whether it's, reducing emissions, saving fuel, making them easier to move around, or a mix of these things.
Right.
And the kinds of clean cook stoves, they vary across different regions in Tanzania.
Good.
Locally made stoves can be very cheap, like from 1,000 Tanzanian shillings to 10,000.
Okay.
But imported ones can be much more expensive, around 60,000.
Wow.
Yeah. Traditional, all metal charcoal stoves, they're cheap, but not very efficient.
Right.
And then you have those that have ceramic liners.
Yeah.
They work better, but they cost more.
Right. So that difference in price is pretty big, but, using less fuel, that must save people a lot of money too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Ministry of Natural Resources and Tourism, they have some data that suggests a household using a traditional charcoal stove, they might go through like a whole ton of charcoal a year,
Wow.
which costs around 125,000 shillings per month. But with an improved stove, they might only use 0.4 tons, bringing that monthly cost down to 50,000.
Wow. So that's a pretty significant saving.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And then you have those even more kind of high-tech stoves like the EnviroFit charcoal stove.
Right.
Which, it costs more to buy, like 75,000 shillings.
Yeah.
But it can save you up to 60% on fuel.
Yeah.
And cut down your cooking time by half.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. So the report also mentions, other technologies being used in Tanzania, like rocket stoves, ethanol stoves, these modern gasifier stoves. What's happening with those?
So the rocket stoves, they were initially supported by GIZ's ProBEC program,
Okay.
but production didn't really continue after the program ended.
No? Okay.
And then you have ethanol stoves. Those were introduced by Safi International.
Right.
And they're using a franchising model to get those out there.
Okay.
And then there's been some development of those modern gasifier stoves, like the Jiko Mbono and the Jiko Safi. And those actually use local fuels like pellets or jatropha seeds.
Oh, interesting. So what about LPG in Tanzania?
Right.
I know the government made some changes there a while back.
Yeah. So back in 2006, they decided to remove all the taxes on LPG and the cylinders,
Okay.
but not on the cookers and accessories.
Right.
So that led to more people adopting it. Maybe more because gas and cylinders were easier to get, not just because of the price.
Right.
But the market still faces problems. Like the cost of setting up those refilling stations is still high.
Yeah.
And then distribution, especially in and around cities, isn't great.
So it seems like Tanzania has all these different clean cooking options, but there are still challenges in getting everyone to use them. What are the initiatives trying to do about that?
Yeah, so there's definitely more awareness now of how important clean cook stoves are for, affordable, sustainable, modern cooking. And there are some key programs that are working on this, like CARE International has the W Power Project, and that focuses specifically on getting women into the clean energy value chain.
Oh, okay.
Including cookstoves.
That's really cool.
They've trained over 200 women entrepreneurs who have actually sold a lot of stoves.
That's awesome. That's great. And, that's so important because women are usually the ones doing the cooking and collecting the firewood.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what are some of the other initiatives?
So SNV has the Tanzania Improved Cook Stoves program, that's TICS.
Right.
And they're working on connecting rural and urban biomass users in the lake zone.
Okay.
They've helped set up over 20 small enterprises.
Oh, wow.
And they've sold, thousands of stoves.
Okay, that's great.
And then there's RTI Energy.
Yeah.
They're promoting EnviroFit and burn stoves. And they've even set up a biomass briquette factory in the coast region.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, and then you have the Tanzania Domestic Biogas Program, the TDBP, which is part of the Africa Biogas Partnership Program.
Okay.
They've been working on installing biogas plants around the country.
And then there's the Country Action Plan for Clean Cook Stoves and Fuels.
Yeah.
Which involves SNV, TERIA, and CCFAC. And what are they trying to do?
So their goal is pretty ambitious. They want to reduce charcoal use by 50% by 2020.
Wow.
Through all kinds of actions. They're lobbying for policies, advocating for tax breaks on these technologies, setting up a platform for everyone to work together, developing national standards with the Tanzania Bureau of Standards, that's TBS, based on ISO guidelines. They're doing market research, studying how women are involved, raising awareness, setting up monitoring and evaluation systems, supporting the briquette and pellet fuel industry, and developing market networks.
So it sounds like a really well-rounded approach.
Yeah.
The report also, has this table that looks at specific initiatives and, the partners involved and the challenges they face.
Yeah.
So what are some of the key things we can learn from those examples?
Well, there are definitely some similarities with what we saw in Kenya, Seko and Tateto.
Okay.
They had trouble raising awareness outside of the big cities.
Okay.
E+Co and EnviroFit found that marketing was really resource intensive.
Yeah.
ProBEC struggled to keep things going after the initial funding ran out.
Right.
DEEP, again, was focused on getting entrepreneurs to think more like business people.
Okay.
And the Uganda Carbon Bureau had problems with the process for getting registered for carbon credits.
Yeah.
And there are other projects that focus on specific solutions, like Partners for Development is working on pellet production.
Yeah.
And the Masai Stove Project is focusing on empowering local women.
That's great. So it's all about, it's not just about the technology, but the whole the whole system.
Right. It's about understanding, the social and economic realities on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. So what about the overall policy environment in Tanzania? What's supporting the clean cook stove market?
Well, they have the Biomass Energy Strategy Tanzania project,
Okay.
BEST.
Yeah.
And this one's seen as really inclusive and well-developed.
Yeah.
It involved a lot of stakeholders.
Okay.
And it led to the Tanzania Biomass Energy Strategy and Action Plan.
Right.
And a national best communication strategy.
Okay.
So their goals are really about making sure there's a sustainable supply of biomass, improving how efficiently it's used, promoting other energy sources,
Yeah.
and creating a good environment for the sector to grow.
So has the government used tax breaks or things like that to encourage cleaner energy, similar to Kenya?
Yeah, they have.
Okay.
Back in 2006, they got rid of taxes on LPG and cylinders.
Okay.
And that really helped the market grow.
Yeah.
And then there's a subsidy on connection charges for Tanesco Electricity.
Correct.
That's the national power company. So that also shows that the government wants to promote cleaner options, although it might not have as much of a direct impact on cooking.
Right, right. There's a lot to unpack.
There is a lot to unpack, and we'll pick up right there in the next part of our deep dive.
You're listening to the African Deep Dive podcast. We would love to hear from you. Share your thoughts, suggestions, and comments via social media or email. Thank you for tuning in and stay with us for more insightful conversations.
Let's switch gears now and look at Tanzania. How did things unfold there?
Well, much like Kenya, the journey in Tanzania started around 4 decades ago with the Morogoro wood and charcoal stove. It was a collaborative effort involving local universities and international partners. And this early initiative actually led the Tanzanian government, with a little nudge from the World Bank, to introduce the KCJ, that Kenyan Ceramic Jiko we discussed earlier, in 1988.
So Kenya's early efforts had a direct impact.
They did. It's interesting to see that cross-border influence. And after the KCJ was introduced, Tanzania began developing its own local designs.
Such as?
Stoves like the KUT and Jiko Bora emerged, showing that local innovation. Organizations like Costech and Tatito, they became key players in researching and promoting these stoves. But there's a key difference between Kenya and Tanzania that emerges here. In Tanzania, the cookstove sector has been more reliant on those smaller-scale projects, often funded by donors. And those funding streams, they're not always long-term. So it's created a situation where the sector is more dominated by informal artisans, those skilled craftspeople making stoves on a smaller scale. And that comes with challenges.
Like what?
Well, for one, those informal artisans, they often have limited capacity for large-scale production, which can lead to inconsistencies in quality.
I can see how that would be a problem.
It is. And as a result, Tanzania hasn't really developed that same level of sustained commercial market for clean cook stoves that we see in Kenya. And this is particularly true in rural areas, where the need is arguably the greatest.
So a less mature market.
Exactly. And while some of those imported clean cook stoves, the ones that often boast better efficiency and reduced indoor air pollution, have entered the Tanzanian market, their uptake has been limited.
I'm guessing price is a factor there?
It is. Those imported stoves are generally pricier, and consumer demand hasn't quite reached the same level as in Kenya. In 2015, UNIDO estimated that the adoption rate for improved cook stoves was about 40% in Dar es Salaam.
Okay, so decent in the capital.
Yeah, and around 20% in other urban areas. But nationally, that figure drops to just 3%.
Wow, a significant drop.
It is. And what's interesting is that the report points out that the term clean itself can be relative.
How so?
What's considered clean can vary, depending on what improvements you're looking for, whether it's reduced smoke, better fuel efficiency, or even just improved safety and portability. The types of cook stoves considered cleaner also differ across regions in Tanzania. Those locally made stoves, they can be very basic and quite cheap, ranging from TZS 1,000 to 10,000.
It's very affordable.
They are, but then you have those imported stoves, and those can cost significantly more, sometimes upwards of TZS 60,000. It's a big price difference. Traditional charcoal stoves, those all-metal ones, they're cheap, but their efficiency is really low. Then you have those more efficient ones with ceramic liners, but they're at least 35% more expensive.
So a trade-off between price and efficiency.
It seems that way. But when you factor in the potential cost savings from using less fuel, those improved stoves start to look a lot more appealing.
Okay, talk to me about the fuel savings.
Well, the Tanzanian Ministry of Natural Resources and Tourism, MNRT, they've got some data on this. A household using a traditional charcoal stove might go through about 1 ton of charcoal per year.
That's a lot of charcoal.
It is, and it translates to about TZS 125,000 per month. Now, if they switch to an improved stove, that consumption can drop to around 0.4 tons per year, cutting their monthly costs to TZS 50,000.
So significant savings.
Yeah, and even more advanced stoves, like the EnviroFit charcoal stove, which costs around TZS 75,000, can offer even bigger savings. You're talking up to 60% fuel reduction and 50% less cooking time.
That's impressive. And beyond those charcoal stoves, the report mentions other technologies like rocket stoves, ethanol stoves, and those modern gasifier stoves. What's happening with those?
Well, the rocket stove production that GIZ's ProBEC program initially supported, that didn't really take off in a self-sustaining way after the program ended.
So a good initiative, but perhaps not sustainable in the long run.
That's the challenge, isn't it? Then you have ethanol stoves, introduced by Safi International, and they're using a franchising model to try to scale that up. And locally, they've developed some modern gasifier stoves like the Jiko Mbono and Jiko Safi, which are designed to use renewable fuels like pellets from agricultural waste or jatropha seeds.
Interesting. So tapping into those local resources.
It is. And speaking of fuels, we can't forget about LPG.
Right. What's the situation with LPG in Tanzania? Did they also see those tax benefits that Kenya implemented?
They did. Back in 2006, the government got rid of all taxes on LPG and LPG cylinders. Although taxes on cookers and accessories, those remained in place.
Interesting distinction.
It is. And this tax break did lead to a jump in LPG adoption, about 50% growth in the 6 months following the change.
Wow, so a positive impact, at least initially.
Yeah, but expanding that LPG market further, that faces some hurdles, the high cost of those refilling stations, and the limitations of the distribution infrastructure, especially in urban and peri-urban areas.
So infrastructure is a bottleneck.
It is. And when you step back and look at it all, Tanzania has a decent range of cleaner cooking options available, but those challenges with adoption, those are quite distinct from what we see in Kenya.
Okay, so they're facing their own unique set of obstacles.
They are. But of course, there are a lot of initiatives working to overcome these hurdles. There's a growing understanding in Tanzania that clean cook stoves are a crucial piece of the puzzle for achieving those goals of affordable, sustainable, and modern cooking.
And what are some of the key programs that are leading the charge?
Well, there's CARE International's partnership on women's entrepreneurship in renewables, the W Power Project. It's a great program that focuses on integrating women into the clean energy value chains, including cook stoves. They've trained over 200 women entrepreneurs who've sold over 7,500 cook stoves, which is fantastic.
So empowering women, that's a core focus.
It is. And it makes sense. Women are often the ones who are most impacted by the lack of clean cooking options. Then there's SMV's Tanzania Improved Cookstoves program, TIC-ECS. They're working on strengthening those market links, connecting producers and consumers, both in rural and urban areas in the Lake Zone region. They've supported the creation of over 20 small enterprises in the sector and have facilitated the sale of roughly 6,500 stoves.
So building that market infrastructure.
Exactly. And RTI Energy, they're promoting EnviroFit and burn stoves, and they've even set up a biomass briquette factory in the coast region.
Interesting. So expanding the fuel options as well.
They are. And then you have the Tanzania Domestic Biogas Program, TDBP, which operates under that broader ABPP we talked about earlier. They've been implementing phases with targets for installing domestic biogas plants.
So diversifying the technology mix.
Exactly. And then there's this collaborative initiative, the Country Action Plan for Clean Cook Stoves and Fuels. It involves organizations like SNV, the Tanzania Renewable Energy Association, TURIA, and the Clean Cooking Forum of Tanzania, CCFT.
What are they aiming to achieve?
Their goal is quite ambitious. They want to see a 50% reduction in charcoal use by 2020.
Wow, that's a big target.
It is. And to reach it, they're using a whole suite of interventions, everything from policy lobbying to advocating for tax relief to creating a coordinating platform for stakeholders, developing standards with TBS based on those ISO standards, market research, women's engagement studies, awareness raising, monitoring and evaluation systems, supporting the briquette and pellet industry, and developing market networks. It's comprehensive.
It sounds like they're covering all the bases. You know, it's not just about individual choices.
Okay.
There are these like systemic roadblocks.
Interesting.
So for instance,
Yeah.
you know, taxes on components for these stoves that drives the costs up.
Right.
There's a lack of standardized testing, so it's hard to ensure quality.
Yeah.
And then if clean cooking isn't a priority in national energy plans.
Right.
It just gets less attention,
Less resources.
less funding.
Exactly.
Less everything.
And then on top of that, limited access to financing,
Yeah.
both for producers and consumers, makes it harder to scale up.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the lack of coordination between different players, the government, the
Right.
private sector, NGOs.
Right. It's got to be everybody working together.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
a complex ecosystem.
Yeah.
So all of these things really add up.
Okay, so there are a lot of challenges.
Yeah.
That's clear.
For sure.
But I'm interested in the solutions. Like,
Right.
what can we do about it? What's the report say?
Yeah. So the report actually outlines several potential pathways forward. They call them the drivers of change.
Okay, drivers of change. I like that.
So first and foremost, we got to dismantle those market barriers.
Okay.
Things like reducing taxes and streamlining licensing can make a huge difference.
Mm-hmm.
And then, we need to recognize that one size doesn't fit all.
Right.
So developing market approaches that are tailored to specific local contexts.
Okay, so like what works in Kenya might not work in Tanzania.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And then we have these innovative financing mechanisms like carbon credits.
Oh, yeah. Those are interesting.
Yeah, so basically these are revenues generated from reducing emissions.
Right.
So it's like a way to make clean cooking financially sustainable.
Yeah, like an incentive almost.
Exactly.
That's cool.
And then investing in local research and development because we need to adapt technologies to local needs and preferences.
Makes sense.
And then finally, and this is really crucial, we need to effectively engage the end users,
Right.
particularly women,
Of course.
through culturally relevant behavior change campaigns.
That makes sense.
Because at the end of the day, it's about people adopting and using these stoves.
Totally. So we've got Kenya, we've got Tanzania.
Yeah,
The report looks at both.
it does.
What are some of the key differences or like
Sure.
insights that we get by comparing the two?
So the report points out that Kenya benefits from having more robust institutions
Okay.
and more well-established supply chains,
Okay.
whereas Tanzania's policy landscape seems to be more fragmented and the markets are less developed.
Okay.
However, both countries share a really urgent need for better data,
Oh, interesting. Okay.
to actually track the progress of this transition.
Yeah, actually see what's going on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then standardized testing is crucial to ensure quality.
Right.
And then both countries need consistent and unified advocacy
Okay.
to push for policy changes.
So they need people to kind of bang the drum
Yeah, exactly.
for this, keep this issue on the agenda.
Okay, cool. And something we touched on a little bit earlier
Yeah.
is this idea of gender
Right.
and how this isn't, just a technology issue.
Absolutely not.
It's really about people's lives.
It's about health.
Yeah.
It's about well-being.
Yeah.
And particularly for women.
Right. The report really emphasizes that.
Yeah, the report makes it very clear that women bear the brunt of indoor air pollution.
Because they're the ones often doing the cooking.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
the policies surrounding this transition have to be intentionally gender inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
We need to improve health outcomes.
Right.
But also we need to foster women's economic empowerment.
That's a good point.
Um,
So as we kind of wrap things up here.
yeah. Like, what are some of the most concrete steps that the ATPS report recommends?
So they give a few really actionable recommendations.
Okay, good.
First and foremost, they say lower those trade barriers. Make it easier to import and export the components for these stoves.
Okay.
Second, invest in market intelligence.
Okay.
We need to understand the needs, preferences, and habits of the consumers.
Gather some data.
Exactly.
Okay.
Third, provide funding to boost local innovation, support the development of homegrown solutions.
Okay.
Fourth, actively pursue carbon finance opportunities.
Right.
Tap into that funding stream to make clean cooking sustainable.
It may make sense. Exactly.
And then finally, design behavior change campaigns
Right.
that truly resonate with the communities.
Right.
Make sure they're culturally sensitive and address the real barriers to adoption.
That's great. Yeah.
So, yeah, those are some of the key recommendations.
Wow. So you can really see how addressing something as fundamental as how people cook
Yeah.
can have these far-reaching effects,
Absolutely.
on health,
Mm-hmm.
on the environment, on economic development.
The ripple effects are incredible.
It's really amazing. And it makes you think, like, what other seemingly localized,
Yeah.
technological shifts
Right.
could have similar significant and unexpected ripple effects in
Yeah.
other parts of the world.
Like, what else are we missing?
Yeah, exactly. It's definitely food for thought.
Absolutely.
All right, thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It was really interesting.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, this ATPS report was great.
That's a good one.
Yeah, we'll link to it in the show notes for anyone who wants to check it out.
Definitely.
Okay, see you next time.
Thank you for listening. Join us every Thursday for more insightful conversations.